Welcome to the Campus Outreach Staffcast, a podcast produced by CO staff for CO staff. I am your host, John Elam, and with me is the Campus Outreach Serve Executive Director, Kent Bailey. Glad to dive into another great interview, Kent.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here and looking forward to this one a lot.
Great. Today, our guest is Melanie Rogers, with us from right here at the Campus Outreach Serve Center in Birmingham, Alabama. Kent, would you please introduce Melanie to our Staffcast audience?
Melanie, this is going to be great, and you may be here today, but you're all over the place usually, traveling and ministering to staff and training and equipping, and you have been in a lot of places. So we're looking forward to hearing more of your story. So glad you're here. Thanks for taking out the time to talk with us today.
Fun to get to be here.
Well, as I said, you do get around to a lot of different places and are known by a lot of people, but why don't you start by just giving us your story, but then also what you've done as you've served on staff for now, how many years?
23.
Okay, well, great. Share with us.
So I grew up in a non-Christian family in the nominally Catholic city of New Orleans. All I'd ever heard about God came from 12 years of Catholic school. Then I made what was a not so rational decision to go to college at the University of South Alabama. It's a great school. It just didn't make sense for me to go there. I didn't know anyone going there. It was offered bigger scholarships other places, was going to major in physical therapy. LSU has a great program. It just didn't make sense for me to go there. Other than when I look back, I just think it's where God wanted to put me in the path of Christians for the very first time. So I remember being a sophomore in college and a campus outreach staff person knocked on my door. She was there to see my roommate, who she knew that I had barely known. And when I said she wasn't there, she said, "Well, who are you? I'll stay and talk to you for a few minutes." And we had a very awkward 10-minute stand in the doorway conversation. And then she kept coming back to visit me and built a relationship with me. I can remember never really went to any of the CO stuff. I went to a Bible study once or twice and was not a fan, so didn't go back. One of the things I'm most thankful for is that staff person didn't take that as, oh, let me cross Melanie off of some list.
That's right.
What she saw was that I was open to a relationship with her and that God had given her favor in my eyes. And so just me and her over the next 5 or 6 months, she asked me great questions, shared the gospel with me, and then at one point realized what it meant to be a Christian, realized I wasn't one, but that I wanted to become one. And then once I made that decision to give Christ my life, then I went to all the stuff. You didn't have to recruit me. You just had to tell me when and where to show up, and I was going to be there. So I was discipled for the next 3 or 4 years after that until I graduated.
That's great. And then upon graduation, tell me kind of the story from there.
Yeah, so I was realizing as a senior, I really wanted to go on staff with Campus Outreach. I think probably by that time, not that it was all a great thing, but I was probably majoring in ministry by that point in my collegiate career. I can remember being a team leader on the summer project, meeting with the regional director of our region, expressing my desire to go on staff. And I can remember him asking me if I in any way thought that going on staff with Campus Outreach was in some way a higher calling than going into the marketplace. And I think my answer kind of took him by surprise because I said, "Well, no, if anything, I think it's a lower calling." And he was like, what? And I remember saying, it's like, well, I want to come on staff because I didn't feel ready yet to be a laborer in the marketplace. I knew I'd had a lot of ministry experience in those past few years, but I just knew that I had a lot more to learn. And I figured that if I went on staff, that would give me the opportunity to learn it. And then initially he had told me that he wasn't going to offer me a job because they had full staff teams on all 5 of their campuses. So, but then 2 weeks later, one of those women who was raising support decided God was calling her to do something else with her life. And so a couple of weeks after that, he called me up and offered me a job to be a part of a pioneering team. Campus Outreach wanted to start the ministry on a couple of campuses in Louisiana for the first time. Which I was extremely excited about being a part of because as far as I knew, there were no Christians in Louisiana because I had
You had to
never
come from
met
there.
any.
Yeah.
I had never met any. So I would spend about 10 years on that campus doing campus ministry.
Keep going.
Keep going. So then 10 years at the University of Louisiana in Lafayette. And then I guess around 2009, 2010, by that time I'd gone on several different short-term missions opportunities, both through Campus Outreach and then a lot through our local church partner in Lafayette, and kind of felt a growing restlessness in my heart to really want to one day serve the Lord in a foreign culture, in a foreign land. And so that eventually brought me to Belo Horizonte, Brazil in 2011.
That's great. And we're there until?
Was there until around the end of 2020. So that is soon, just before then, we were able to turn over key leadership positions to Brazilians for the first time on that team. And so a few of our more veteran Americans began to make an exit back to America. So moved from Brazil to Birmingham, Alabama, one of the largest cultural jumps I ever made.
That's right. It just occurs to me that with the three of us here, we could do this in Portuguese.
Sure could do it in Portuguese.
That, people in Brazil would really appreciate, but probably nobody else.
Vamos, gente, vamos.
Vamos.
What's there?
You said several things there, Melanie, that I'd like to follow up on.
Yeah.
One is almost casually you said, and I spent 10 years at the University of Louisiana Lafayette as a staff woman. And that is unusual for a number of reasons. And I'm so thankful that you did that. And that's amazing. There would be a number of staff women listening to this podcast who would say, wow, I'm in my first year on staff. I'm in my second year on staff. And maybe even would say, wow, 10 years, that would be a really long time. I'm not sure I could fathom that or could do that. What enabled you to have that kind of endurance, that kind of sustainability, that kind of ongoing ministry, which I know was fruitful? I was, somewhat connected even back in those days. What were the secrets to that?
It's a really good question. Sometimes as a young staff person, you just don't know to what degree something is hard or not hard comparatively. And so this is what's in front of me.
Yeah.
And man, I was full of vision and passion to just really want God to use my life, to multiply it into other women. And so those were also really hard years, especially the first few, and so I mentioned it was a pioneering team of 3, 2 other men and me. And so back then that meant those 2 men went to campus together every day and went to the dorms together and the cafeteria together. And I went by myself. And so I even, now as a 46-year-old woman, I look back on that and I'm like, how did I do that?
Exactly.
So I still have the question that they're
Okay.
at. I was like, by the grace of God.
Amen.
And I think when I look back, I think there's just a level of courage and boldness that God really just granted me to do what was required in that season. And I can remember then even really praying often that God would send me a teammate, send me a co-laborer. And of course, often when we pray, we have a very specific way that we imagine
Sure.
God to answer that. And I remember in my mind, what I was praying for is that the CO director would decide to send another staff woman to that campus, but that is not how God answered that prayer. And so I look back and it really was this first generation of freshman women that I started spending time with and sharing the gospel with, seeing some of them come into a relationship with Jesus, having an opportunity to disciple them, seeing them catch a vision for God to use their lives to reach other women. In essence, they became my teammates and co-laborers. And probably back then, I wouldn't have, again, asked God to answer that prayer that way. But sitting here today, I actually can't think of a more beautiful way
That's right.
for God to raise up co-laborers than through the process of multiplication.
Amen.
I think another very helpful part of persevering was just, I really do think we had a great local church partner. And it was really the first time I got to experience really being an engaged member of a local church. And so this was a church that I would say they really did love and enjoy God and love and enjoy each other. It was a great church that students could easily fit in. And God just really raised up a community of people where I can look and see men and women that he provided who were like mothers and fathers to me, others who were like big brothers and big sisters, others who were a bit like grandparents. Some of those people still support me 20 years
Wow.
later. So he really did raise up a great Cajun family
Mm.
to support me in that season.
That's great. Well, you touched on something else that I wanted to return to, and that was in your story talking about going from complete non-Christian to the point of when you graduated from college, you had a vision and a commitment to being a laborer, and even an awareness of a level of I'm not fully equipped to be that. So a couple things I want to ask in that. What were the things that God used to build that commitment to being a laborer in your life? Like, I'm sure there were moments, I'm sure there were seasons, but just what were some of the things that God used for you personally that really drove that home for you to be a laborer?
The memory that's coming to mind right now, I think this was maybe my first summer project. There's usually a night that's really focused on the Great Commission. And I remember, I think we had a big summer project. It was like probably 160, 180 people. That felt big to me. And I remember someone saying, only maybe about 10% of you are going to labor for a lifetime. And I don't know where you've got that statistic from, but issuing the challenge. And I remember just really thinking like, what? Well, I will be one of those 10%. I don't know what the rest of you guys are thinking, but like, what do I have to do to be in that? Like, this is what I want to give my life to. And I want to do whatever it takes for that to be central for the rest of my life. And I think there was also a sense of, I don't know, I just felt like I had a good level of understanding of what I had been on the receiving end of for the past few years. And I think that was another big motivator to wanting to go on staff, was maybe out of gratitude. I wanted to be able to offer to other people what I felt so blessed to be on the receiving end of. I've been really blessed. I would like to be a blessing to other people in that same way.
That's great. Well, the second part of that I wanted to hit on really connects to something that is very pertinent to our conversation and to what we're doing in the staff cast. Is at some point, I think as staff, we need to think about what is the sort of irreducible minimum that we want students who are meaningfully involved in the ministry on campus to walk off of the campus with. And things have changed, obviously, since you were on staff there in those years.
Sure.
And we've talked about how the student population has changed and all of that. And so one of the things I've said is that if nothing else, a student who is involved in the ministry needs to walk away with a commitment to becoming a laborer, because so few are obviously fully developed laborers when they leave the campus. But that sense of the harvest is plentiful, the laborers are few, I want to be a laborer, and I know I'm not one yet. And so I want to do whatever it takes to grow over the next few years, no matter what course of life I take. I want to become a more fully developed laborer. You seem to be the classic example of that. What enabled you to get to that end of your college time and have that understanding of, I both want to be this, but I'm not this, therefore I'm going to make some decisions in light of ultimately becoming that?
That's a really good question. I'll give more than the first answer that comes to mind, which I don't mean to oversimplify or over spiritualize, but I really just keep thinking by the grace of God.
Amen.
By the grace of God, I made those decisions. But I was also thinking about how, when I was first beginning to learn about leadership, at some point first taught the 3 questions of, where am I taking them? Where are they now? What's the next step? And I think I just had to apply that to my own life and think about, who do I want to become? What do I want to be true of my life in 10, 20, 30, 40 years? I don't know that I asked myself that specific question, but I think had that vision of, what is it that I really want my life to be about? And then I don't know that it was a whole lot of self-awareness at that part of my life yet, that season, but with the self-awareness that I had, I think I'd had a really great ministry experience as a student, had opportunities to go along with someone else, to learn how to share my faith, to have a ministry focus area where I was building relationships and share my faith, saw women become Christians and got to disciple some of them. But even I was meeting with one of our field staff the other day, And we just talked about how just because you get to do something once doesn't mean you're equipped to do it.
That's right.
Even was on a call with some field leaders this morning, and we just said, very rarely does anyone crush anything the first time they do it. And so it was like I'd had those first experiences, but it's like I really do have a lot to learn, and I'd really like to get good at this because I would really love for God to use me to do things like this for the rest of my life. And so,
and he has.
That last question, what's the next step? And I don't think it's the only next step that someone could take. But for me, what came to mind is, well, if I go on staff with Campus Outreach, I think that is the next step to further equip me to who I want to become in the long run.
So I want to ask this question just from a different angle.
Okay.
You're now 23 years into serving on staff, and you're able to right now, because of the podcast, that if go back and speak to staff men and staff women who are in their first 5 years on staff, let's say, and they're laboring on the campus, how would you encourage them to pass that vision of being a laborer, of becoming a laborer, where that same thing that happened to you can happen to the students they're discipling? How would you encourage them to cultivate that, to stimulate that in the people that they're discipling?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is just to invite those students into their process about how they're thinking to do that for themselves. Let the people you're leading really get to know you and your heart, and let them see how you made those decisions and are continuing to try to make those decisions.
That's awesome.
Melanie, we had the privilege of working together for 10 years there in Belo Horizonte. Really enjoyed always the years that we worked through several different roles and lots of different fun and not fun things.
What?
But I'd love for everybody else to get a glimpse into that time that you spent in Brazil. So please, if you could kind of walk us through your experience. I would love to hear, even you want to say a little bit more about how you decided to mobilize to Brazil, specifically to Brazil, some of your time there on staff, and also just some of the major themes that you think God taught you in that season.
Yeah, when I think about how I even came to make the decision to go to Brazil, I would say it was kind of a bit of a hot mess to start out with. Like I knew I wanted to go somewhere, but I was never someone that had like a very specific where. I can even remember sitting in my missions pastor's office talking about my desire to go somewhere. And he spun his globe and was like, you could go anywhere. And I'm like, no, we need to filter this. And so I had started paying attention to, okay, well, what are some places and some people that God had already connected me with? Had been helped lead a CCP to Guadalajara, Mexico in 2006 and 2007, was pursuing an option there with Mission to the World. I was looking into a missionary training program to work with in Puerto Rico called ILDP. Was actually walking in that direction, and then God did some things to redirect. And I was like, okay, Lord, I'd really love to go somewhere. Where do you want me to go? And I was talking to a friend. She said, she's like, I'm just curious, why aren't you really looking at places with campus outreach? And I said, well, I wouldn't even know how to begin to do that. I think that was a season of our ministry where we were very separate and siloed. But she said to me, there's this guy that I think you should talk to. His name's Kent Bailey. And she gave me Kent Bailey's phone number. I don't even know if you remember this, but called that number. Hi, this is Kent Bailey. This is Melanie Rogers. Been on staff with Campus Outreach for a long time. Would love to go overseas somewhere. I heard that you might be someone I could talk to about doing that with Campus Outreach. Do you remember this?
I remember the meeting that we had at Simpsonwood.
Okay, so Kent's idea was, well, interestingly enough, all of our international ministry leaders are going to be in Atlanta next month. Why don't you drive on up and we'll have like a 5-on-1 interview? So sure. Bebopped my way over to Atlanta. That's kind of where the story got started. It's a long story short to end up in Brazil, although I do like to highlight, I think God is sovereign over how we go about making a mess of our decisions sometimes, but I really think I stressed out way too much about trying to figure out what was God's will for my life. Like I almost remember kind of having a picture. I'd had a handful of real options in front of me, and it was like I pictured them each as like a door, and like that there was one right door that I had to like figure out what was the right door. But if I'd picked any of the other doors, that there was like this bottomless abyss on the other end of, and I was somehow going to miss God's will for my life. But the reality was, all the options I was looking at that point, every single one of them were God honoring, kingdom building decisions. I probably could have eeny, meeny, miny, mowed it and been just, I'm not suggesting we do that, but God used all of that, even in my process of development, to still bring me to where he really wanted me to be, which was Brazil. And so moved my life there in 2011. And I would say that was a season of ministry where I feel like I really started to learn more about myself, like my unique design and what are my gifts and my passions. Where I look back on that decade in Louisiana, it was just a lot about getting ministry experience and just learning how to do the foundational things of walking with God and giving my life away. And I think those years in Brazil really allowed me to more learn, okay, how has God uniquely made me? And what are some of the things that he really wants to use me to do for the long haul? And so that started to impact the role and responsibilities I had while I was there, and just really getting to figure out what can I offer specifically to a team that I'm serving with. I also think a huge takeaway from my years in Brazil was, I think that's really where I learned that evangelism needs to involve both sharing and showing the gospel, that people need to not only hear it, but also experience it. That was really prominent in the way that we talked about ministry there. And the way I think about this today is, I think we often talk about being salt and being light to the lost world around us. And salt is primarily tasted, and light is primarily seen and felt. And these are experiences. So people need to experience the gospel before they're going to believe it. And I think kind of with that, we just often talked about how the most effective evangelism tool we have is community. And I would say my season of ministry in Brazil is where I really learned that laboring is a team sport. It is not an individual sport. So I left those years with John 13, 34, and 35 burned into my mind and into my heart, the reality of Jesus saying, hey, as I have loved you, love one another. And he's talking to his disciples, and that by this, all men will know that you are my disciples. By what? By how you engage in relationship with one another, by the community that you're experiencing with each other. So I think that was a major thing that shifted for me.
Melanie, you keep throwing out these really great truths and realities and just skipping over them almost. So I want to come back to a couple of those. One is let's call it paradigm shift that you had about God's providence and God's will for your life, because that seems incredibly relevant today when so many people can feel paralyzed about what's God's will and how to understand that. And so you grew in your relationship with God from a previous point to a place of saying, I trust you. You've given me multiple options here. Probably could pick just about any of these. In some way, shape, or form, you're going to use this to glorify yourself and for my benefit. Walk us in that process. What is it that went from maybe a previous belief you had about God's will that you talked about to this understanding that God really is sovereign and his providence really is a great thing, and you could, in a sense, rest in that, but also be taking active steps in following that?
First just came a realization that God will always be way more interested in me knowing his will for my life than I am. So like he wants to lead me and guide me, and he will lead and guide me. I think sometimes I can even have this picture in my mind. You know, I love hiking and going out on trails, and I don't naturally have a good sense of direction. And so I do a lot of hiking by myself. And initially there was fear of, what if I get lost? I'm like, I'm looking for the path. Where's the path? Where's the path? And then sometimes there's moments where you just have to go look down. You are on the path. Like the truth is, I am on God's path for my life. I am not going to miss it. He doesn't want me to miss it. I actually don't have to exert all of this energy to live in the fear of what I would call like the paralysis of analysis. Oh my gosh, the fear of making a wrong decision. And it's like, no, God is leading and guiding. This comment is skipping ahead, but I can see where I am today and look back on the past 20 plus years and see how God has suited me for what I'm doing today. I've been on a path all along. I just didn't know where I was going. And so I do think there's just maybe a deeper trust between me and him, because it's not like I always love where he takes me. It's just trusting, no, like God has a path for me and I'm not going to miss it. And so I don't have to live in an anxiety over that.
That's awesome. Well, one of the other things that you mentioned, I think, speaks to and dispels one of the many myths that exist about Campus Outreach. There, one is the phantom staff person. There's this ideal staff person, and I need to be that. Another one is that, I'll get to some point in my spiritual growth and leader development where I know everything and have all the answers. And you just alluding to that even today, 20 plus years into walking with the Lord, serving the Lord, that you're still learning, you're still growing. So if you said over the past year or so, the big things that God's teaching you now that you're learning in this season, what are some of those things?
Part of why this is a hard question to answer is because I feel like it's a really long list. I feel like
Give us a couple.
Yeah, I feel like I've been in a very high learning curve for sure. So I think one of these things is strategy versus spiritual discernment. I would say strategic thinking is one of my greatest natural strengths. And I was reading a book one day that said, just because something is strategic doesn't mean it's the will of God.
That's right.
And I just was like, ooh, like I was like, ouch, that I felt that. And I think what has stuck with me since then is our work is spiritual in nature. And the essence of that means it is of the Spirit. It is spiritual in nature more than it is strategic in nature. And so my brain might be able to rapid fire see what is a strategic choice. And that's fine to let my brain do what it does. But then absolutely have to hold that out and say, Lord, what is your will? What is of your Spirit? What would you have us do? And so I think just really being able to listen more to the Spirit, that probably connects with another, I think, just major learning curve is just, I think I've really come to value silence, solitude, and slowing down. I think that really came. So I had a season between my time in Brazil and Birmingham where I spent a few months on sabbatical. And I would say that that's really where I learned to love silence and to just really love being alone and in solitude with God. So that came from, I spent most of that sabbatical in Colorado Springs, and I did a lot of hiking, and I was hiking by myself. I knew one person in that town, and it was still COVID reality. And so she lived at the foothills of a 10,000-foot mountain. I would often go hiking by myself with my poor sense of direction. And at that point in my life, I was always the person who had the soundtrack of my life playing in the background. I had music in the background all the time. So I'm going off on my hike and I have my earbuds in, loud music. And I remember thinking, you know what? This might not be the smartest thing to be doing because I'm a woman hiking by herself. If there were an ill-meaning person out here, I wouldn't be able to hear them coming. Or if there's a bear or a mountain lion, I would be clueless. So I was like, it's probably smart for me to take my earbuds out. And so now I'm hiking in the quiet. And all I can really hear is the leaves rustling in the winds, the birds making noises, the sound of my footsteps on the gravel, my breath. That's high altitude. Sometimes I could hear my heartbeat. And I just started to really fall in love with being quiet and grew to really be more aware of God's presence. And I would say that's where I started to learn to listen in my prayers than speak. There's some slowing down that comes with that. So maybe I'll share this other story. This was 2 years ago. I was on a bullet train from London to Paris. And, bullet trains, they can go about 200 miles per hour. And I remember just sitting at the window and looking out the window. And you can't even really make out what you're looking at when you're looking out the window on a bullet train. You're going so fast. I could tell if I was kind of in an urban setting or if I had switched to be like in the countryside, but couldn't really see anything. And for some reason, I just started thinking about, if I'm a passenger in a car and I'm looking out the window, I can see more than what I'm seeing right now on this bullet train. And if I were riding a bicycle instead of being in a car and I looked to the side, I could see more from my bicycle than I could see from the car, than I could see from the bullet train. If I were walking, I could see more than I could see from the bicycle, than the car, than the bullet train. And if I stood still, imagine all of what I could see and the detail that I could take in.
Yep.
And all that means is that the slower you go, the more you see. And the faster you go, the less you see. And I think in our job, what we're often looking at is people. And so I think I had to start to ask myself, man, do I really see the people in front of me, or am I moving too fast? Then I'm thinking about Jesus. He was incredibly productive and incredibly fruitful, and yet I never imagined him in a hurry. And he was awesome at really seeing the people that he was looking at. And so I know that I don't naturally go slow, even physically. Like, I do things quickly. And I even remember I was doing this leader development course a couple years ago with the navigators, and I was being coached through my Clifton strengths. You know, there's that list of 34 strengths. And I remember she commented, she said, several of these strengths allow people to move fast. When you look at your primary strengths, what do you notice about this list? And I was like, oh, most of what's on the fast list is my list of strengths. She goes, here's the list of strengths that people could have that would lend them to go slow. What do you notice when you look at your list? Oh, I don't have any of those. So I don't naturally go slow, but I've been really learning the value of slowing down. I think it's allowing me to really hear the Lord better, like giving him all of my attention. And that really requires a willingness to slow down. And I also think it's been a key thing that is helping me learn how to love people better.
Which is so key in being present
Amen.
with people, that slowing down, that seeing them.
Yeah.
As you're talking about.
I can't remember when we had this conversation, but I think I was talking to you about my role today and just the difference between, you know, leading from long distance versus getting to be up close with people. And we were talking about how people lead. And you'd said, you know, some people will lead out of position and kind of lean on their position and their authority for leadership. You said some lead out of preparation. And I think I have historically been one of those people who it's like, man, I want to be prepared. Yeah. You know, John's asked me to do the podcast. He sent me some questions. I want to prepare. I want to be ready. But in my role here, when I'm getting on calls with field leaders, one of the questions I always want to ask them is, how can I be most helpful to you today?
Yeah.
And I have no idea what they're going to say. And what that means is I can't prepare.
That's right.
All I can do is get on a call and be fully present with them and discern the spirit and trust that the Lord is going to give me something to offer them. And that could be ideas, examples, questions, empathy, understanding. And so I add that in because I think the learning to value slowing down is what's enabling me to be more present in my leadership, but honestly in all of life. And so I think it's one of the things I've been most thankful for that God's doing.
Well, and then that idea of preparation, we place a lot of value, particularly as Westerners, on mental or intellectual preparation. Like, I need to think through. They use that term a lot, you know,
Sure.
all the things that might come up or the questions or the issues, and don't devalue that at all, but their spiritual preparation, me preparing my heart, my soul is just as important. And are we giving it that kind of attention? So that's really good.
No, I mean, that makes me think of, you mentioned earlier, you know, I have a good bit of opportunities to visit with a lot of our teams on the field. And I've been thinking, you and I have even talked some about what are good rhythms and how to think about pace and all of that. And I remember I was meeting with another mentor and talking about, I'm learning what it looks like to have a good recovery plan, you know, from those trips, you know, an intense 2 to 3 weeks away. And she said, that's really good, Melanie. And I wonder what your ramp up plan looks like for that. And I was like, well, the days right before I go somewhere are kind of a frenzy as I'm, you know, finishing normal work and then finishing preparation for whatever it is I'm going to be doing there. And she was like, I know that, you know, when you're visiting these teams, you're meeting with a lot of different people. And I think it's good for you to think about, what does it mean for your spirit to be in a calm, quiet, listening position before you go into something like that. So just to say an amen to your last comment.
That's it.
This has been just part 1 of our conversation. Stay tuned and catch part 2 in the next week. Make sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting service to get each new upcoming episode. The Campus Outreach Staffcast is a production of Campus Outreach Serve. The vision of Campus Outreach is to glorify God by building laborers on the campus for the lost world. To learn more, visit www.campusoutreach.org.